When a young girl ran to a mailman, pleading for help to escape from her abusive father, he initially thought it might be a young child's imagination running wild, yet one thing she said shocked him to the core, revealing a dark truth, one that put the girl's life in unimaginable danger. This was a story of bravery, resilience, and the relentless fight for justice. Before we dive in, let everyone know where you're watching from, and if you believe the truth should always come to light, be sure to like and subscribe for more. Tom Warren had been a mailman in the town of Fairview for nearly a decade. By most measures, he led a quiet, unassuming life. He was a man who cherished solitude, found solace in routine, and preferred the company of his own thoughts to crowded gatherings. Every morning, he rose before sunrise, made a steaming cup of tea, and took a slow walk to the postal office, relishing the calm hush of a town still asleep. The job, in many ways, suited him. He delivered letters and parcels door to door, greeted neighbors with a nod or a polite smile, then continued his solitary rounds. There was a simple, repetitive comfort in the path he walked each day. People in Fairview recognized him but seldom engaged in long conversation, for Tom's reticent manner made them guess he preferred the quiet. One crisp autumn morning, the air was tinged with a faint scent of burning leaves, an aroma that always reminded Tom of childhood bonfires. He had just started his route when he caught sight of a young girl running toward him, her backpack askew, her hair tangled as though she had barely managed to tie it. Instantly, he felt a tremor of concern. Children in Fairview usually walked to school together or rode the bus. They did not run alone on the side of a quiet street at that early hour. As she drew nearer, he saw tears on her cheeks, and her breath came in stuttered gasps. "Help me!" she cried. "Please help me!" Tom paused, stunned. He was not used to anyone, let alone a small child, approaching him with such desperation. He glanced around to see if someone was chasing her, but he found only the stillness of a residential street. Houses with neatly trimmed lawns, closed windows, and that creeping hush of a neighborhood not yet fully awake. He knelt down, set his mailbag aside, and looked at the trembling girl. She was small, maybe around 11 years old, with a pale complexion and wide, fearful eyes. "What's wrong?" Tom asked gently. He tried to keep his voice calm so as not to scare her further. She sniffled, trying to gulp down enough air to speak. "My father. I can't go back there." Tom's first reaction was confusion. He wondered if this might be a child who had argued with her parents and run off in a moment of anger or misunderstanding. It happened sometimes. Children had wild imaginations, and small problems loomed large in their minds. Yet something in the girl's expression told him this was far from an ordinary domestic dispute. The terror in her eyes was too real, too raw. He stood up and guided her to a nearby bench under a willow tree. The morning sun cast long shadows across the pavement, and the leaves rustled overhead, as though unsettled by the sudden appearance of distress. "What happened?" he asked softly. "Tell me." At first, she struggled with her words. She told him her name was Eleanor Smith, that her father had been hurting her. She spoke of bruises and locked doors, and how her mother, Sally, had suddenly vanished not long ago. Tom's heart sank further with each detail. There was something about the way this child spoke, voice trembling, eyes darting with fear as if expecting her father to emerge from the shadows any second, that made him realize this was no mere tall tale. "He killed her," Eleanor whispered at last, fresh tears filling her eyes. "I know he did." Tom felt a chill run the length of his spine. He swallowed, trying to think of how to respond. "Killed who?" he asked carefully, though he feared the answer. She bowed her head, tears spotting her jacket. "My mother, Sally. She disappeared one night, and he said she ran away, but she never would have left me. Never." For several moments, Tom could not speak. It felt like the air around him had thickened, and he had to push each breath out like a heavy weight. He realized, with a lurch of guilt, that he had first suspected this was a childish exaggeration. But the look in Eleanor's eyes was not the product of an overactive imagination. This was a child in genuine peril, a child who had just revealed a horror that defied belief. Even if he did not know for certain whether her claims were entirely accurate, his conscience screamed at him that he had to take immediate action. Slowly, he reached for his phone, intending to call for help, but Eleanor's small hand gripped his wrist. "Please," she begged, her voice trembling. "Don't just take me back to him." Tom's voice faltered as he replied, "I won't. I promise. But we need to tell someone who can protect you. Maybe the school nurse, Mrs. Reynolds. I know she helps kids sometimes, and she can call Child Protective Services or the police. We need to make sure you're safe." Eleanor gave a small, broken nod. Relieved that she was willing to trust him even in the midst of her terror, Tom gently patted her shoulder. He left his mailbag on the bench, took Eleanor by the hand, and together they walked toward the school grounds. The day was only just beginning to warm, but Tom felt a coldness in his stomach, as if some fundamental sense of order had been yanked out from under him. How could a man hurt his own daughter? How could an entire town not know? Despite the early hour, the school nurse's office was open. Mrs. Reynolds, a middle-aged woman with a kind face and a penchant for pink sweaters, looked up from her desk in surprise. She had known Tom for years. He delivered mail to the school almost daily, but she had never seen him look so distressed. "Tom?" she asked. "Is everything all right? Who's this?" Eleanor shrank behind Tom, hiding her face. Tom cleared his throat, trying to steady his voice. "Mrs. Reynolds, this is Eleanor Smith. She needs help." Mrs. Reynolds immediately stood, concern etched on her features. "Come in, both of you. Tell me what's happened." Eleanor's story poured out in stammers and sobs. She told Mrs. Reynolds of her father's rages, how she hid in closets to avoid his anger, how he used to tell her that if she ever told anyone, no one would believe her anyway. She wept as she described her mother, Sally, and how they had once baked cookies together every Sunday. She recounted the night her mother went missing, the muffled shouts behind a closed bedroom door, the heavy silence the next morning, and then her father's explanation that Sally had simply run off. Mrs. Reynolds placed a gentle hand on Eleanor's arm, her expression grim. "I believe you," she said softly. "I'm going to call Child Protective Services and the police right now." Tom exhaled, feeling a slight loosening of the knot in his stomach. He met Mrs. Reynolds's gaze, grateful that someone with authority was stepping in. He knew how these processes typically went, how careful officials had to be in matters of suspected abuse, but the urgency in Eleanor's voice left no room for doubt. Something terrible was happening at the Smith home, and it had to be stopped. Mrs. Reynolds picked up the phone, her calm but resolute voice filling the small office as she explained the situation to the relevant authorities. Tom squeezed Eleanor's shoulder reassuringly as she quietly sobbed into her hands. He did not know what to say to ease her terror. He was a mailman, not a counselor, not a cop. Still, he told himself, sometimes simply being there for someone, letting them know they were not alone, was the first step. In less than an hour, a social worker arrived at the school, accompanied by a local police officer who was tall and wore a neatly pressed uniform. They both asked Eleanor gentle questions, coaxing out the details. The officer took notes, looking more and more troubled with every word. Eleanor clung to Tom's side the entire time. She only let go when the social worker eventually persuaded her that she would be taken to a safe place, and that her father would not be informed of her location. Tom stood quietly, uncertain if his presence was truly helpful, but reluctant to leave her alone amid strangers. By late morning, the wheels were set in motion. Child Protective Services placed Eleanor in an emergency foster home, and the police launched an investigation into Sally's disappearance. Tom found himself excused from further involvement, at least for the moment. He returned to his mail route, his mind in disarray. Houses that had once looked quaint and friendly suddenly appeared ominous. He realized that none of them had any idea what he had just learned, that they were tidily going about their daily lives while a horrendous secret had lurked behind closed doors. He tried to focus on the job at hand, but he kept thinking about Eleanor. The image of her tear-stained face haunted him, and the dreadful suspicion about her mother weighed heavily on his chest. Occasionally, An older neighbor would wave at him from a porch, or a dog would bark behind a fence, but Tom felt oddly disconnected from it all. The world carried on, while a child's life had been irrevocably turned upside down. That evening, Tom ate dinner alone in his small, modest home. He microwaved a frozen meal, which tasted bland as he pushed it around the plate. He tried to watch a nature documentary to calm his mind, but the scenes of wild animals in distant places only made him feel more isolated. Eventually, he switched off the television and sank onto his couch, letting the darkness of the house envelop him. He wondered how Eleanor was doing. Was she scared in a strange new home, or was she relieved to be out of her father's reach? He thought about how horrifying it was that she believed her father had killed her mother. Could that really be true? Or was there some other explanation, something less tragic? But the fear in Eleanor's eyes had been so genuine. He shuddered to think of a father capable of such brutality. In the quiet gloom, he promised himself that, in whatever capacity he could, he would make sure she stayed safe. He could not pretend this was none of his business. He had seen too much of her pain to walk away. The next few days were a blur of official updates and local rumors. Word spread around Fairview that a man named Andrew Smith might have committed a terrible crime. Police officers knocked on neighbors' doors for statements. The rumor mill began churning, fueled by gossip about the Smiths. Had anyone heard loud fights? Had anyone seen suspicious activity in the home? People who had once dismissed Andrew Smith as a quiet, somewhat brooding individual began to recall uneasy impressions. Some said they had noticed bruises on Eleanor but had dismissed them as childhood accidents. Others claimed they had heard muffled shouting coming from the house at odd hours. Yet no one had stepped forward or intervened until now. Then, one morning, Tom heard that Andrew had fled town before the police could question him. That news alone spoke volumes. He remembered the suffocating dread on Eleanor's face as she recounted her suspicions. If Andrew was innocent, why run? If there had been a tragic accident or some misunderstanding, wouldn't he have stayed to clear his name? The sinking feeling in Tom's chest grew heavier. Still, there was a chance that Andrew's flight meant he was gone for good, no longer an immediate threat to Eleanor's physical safety. But the open question of Sally's fate remained. Even in a small town, a person could go missing under the worst of circumstances. A few weeks later, the truth was laid bare. The authorities discovered Sally's remains in a shallow grave outside town. That discovery made headlines in the local newspaper. It was accompanied by the grim revelation that Sally had died from violent injuries. The medical examiner's report pointed to homicide, and there was no longer any doubt about the kind of man Andrew Smith was. Tom read the article in silent horror, struggling to comprehend the depravity and cruelty it took to end another person's life, let alone the mother of one's own child. Eleanor remained in foster care as the legal system churned forward. Eventually, Andrew was captured several states away after a frantic manhunt. He had been hiding under an assumed name in a cheap motel when an anonymous tip led the police right to him. News of his arrest brought a wave of relief to Tom and everyone else in Fairview who had followed the story. At last, the immediate threat was contained. The court proceedings that followed were thorough, exposing Andrew as a violent man with a history of controlling behavior. He was convicted and sentenced to several decades in prison for Sally's murder. Justice, in a sense, had been served, though it could never undo the horror inflicted on Sally or the emotional scars left on Eleanor. In the months that followed, Eleanor was placed with a loving foster family, a couple named the Petersons who had a gentle manner and a warm home. They lived in a cozy house with a flowering dogwood in the yard, and they had experience fostering children who came from traumatic situations. It was said they were open to adoption, and after spending time with Eleanor, they grew to love her as though she were their own. Slowly, she began to trust them, though the weight of her past did not vanish overnight. She was still haunted by nightmares and struggled with the aftermath of her father's cruelty. Yet in this new environment, she had the chance to heal. During this time, Tom found himself thinking often of Eleanor, and eventually he decided to visit. He asked the Petersons if it would be all right for him to stop by. He was worried about imposing, But he also felt a genuine concern for the girl whose plea for help had thrown him into her life. The Petersons agreed, believing it might help Eleanor to connect with someone who had been there for her at the very beginning of her ordeal. On his first visit, Tom brought a small potted plant, a delicate African violet with lavender blooms. He had no clue what girls her age might like, but he suspected that something alive, something she could nurture, might be a symbol of growth and fresh beginnings. The Petersons led him into the living room, which was furnished in a homey style with soft couches and paintings of sunflowers on the walls. Eleanor sat on an armchair, wearing a tentative smile, her hands folded in her lap. "It's good to see you," Tom said quietly, placing the plant on the coffee table. I wanted to check on you. See how you were doing." She nodded, her eyes roaming over the plant. "Thank you," she whispered. "For everything." He did not know how to respond, so he simply nodded. The tension softened slightly when Mr. Peterson, a kindly man in his 60s, suggested they all have some lemonade in the kitchen. Over the sweet, cold drinks, Tom and Eleanor began to converse, albeit slowly. She thanked him again for believing her story and for taking her to the nurse. He confessed he was just relieved that he had done the right thing in that moment, that he had not walked away or allowed doubt to paralyze him. Their bond developed gradually. Sometimes Tom would drop off small gifts, a sketch pad, colored pencils, a puzzle. Other times he and Eleanor would sit in the Petersons' backyard, watching birds flutter around a feeder. On one occasion, he brought a stray cat he had found near the post office, thinking the Petersons might adopt it if they chose. They ended up taking the cat to a local shelter, but Eleanor sat on the kitchen floor for half an hour just petting the cat and letting it curl up in her lap. She seemed to find comfort in quiet companionship, be it from animals or from Tom, whose gentle manner resonated with her. Over the course of a year, Eleanor and Tom grew closer. He became something like an uncle or a mentor figure, always willing to lend an ear. Occasionally, he would drive her to therapy sessions when the Petersons were busy, or wait outside her art class so he could see her latest painting. She flourished in art. The bright colors and boundless creativity allowed her to express feelings she could not put into words. Sometimes those paintings were dark swirls that represented nightmares. Other times they were depictions of a hopeful future, pictures of smiling families or of the sun rising over a green hill. But amid this fragile peace, fear still loomed in the back of Eleanor's mind. She knew Andrew was in prison, but the terror he had planted in her psyche was not so easily banished. She worried about him returning someday. The possibility seemed remote, yet nightmares did not always adhere to logic. Tom tried to reassure her, telling her that Andrew would be behind bars for a very long time. The Petersons assured her too, as did her therapist. Yet her nightmares persisted, especially on nights when the wind howled or when a sudden noise in the house startled her awake. As time went on, Tom also found some measure of personal healing through his newfound connection with Eleanor. Before meeting her, he had led a solitary life, haunted by vague regrets he could never quite articulate. Now, caring for her made him aware of how meaningful it felt to be needed, to do something that truly mattered. He found himself taking more notice of the people around him, even forging small friendships with neighbors he had barely spoken to before. He realized that in the act of helping someone else, he had helped himself to step out of the shell he had inhabited for so long. Eleanor's progress, too, was notable. With therapy and the Petersons' unwavering support, she began doing better in school, forming friendships, and even trying out for the art club. Sometimes she caught herself laughing without fear, without that pang of worry that had once constricted her chest. Yet a sense of unease still clung to her, a leftover from the trauma she had survived. She had once experienced the worst betrayal possible, from her own father. Trust did not come easily after that, even when Andrew was locked away. She had nightmares where she would see her father's face twisted with rage, or find herself locked in a dark closet, no one around to hear her screams. On particularly bad nights, she would cry to Mrs. Peterson, who would hold her close and promise her she was safe. Then, in a development that no one foresaw, Andrew escaped from prison. The news broke late one evening, and Tom first heard about it through a frantic phone call from Mrs. Reynolds, the school nurse, who had remained in the loop due to her concern for Eleanor's well-being. She told him that Andrew had orchestrated some elaborate deception. The details were murky, but the fact was inescapable. Andrew was free, and his whereabouts were unknown. Tom's heart pounded so hard he feared he might collapse. His immediate thought was of Eleanor. How would this news devastate her? He could not begin to imagine the terror that would ripple through her life. He thanked Mrs. Reynolds for letting him know, then quickly telephoned the Petersons. They had been informed by law enforcement. Patrol cars were already stationed near their house. They were advised to keep all doors locked, the windows securely fastened, and to remain alert at all times. The police assured them they were doing everything in their power to locate Andrew. The hours that followed passed in a haze of panic and dread. Tom could hardly sleep. He paced the floors of his small living room, phone in hand, jumping at every stray sound outside. He pictured Andrew prowling through the streets of Fairview in the dead of night, searching for Eleanor. The rational part of him argued that the police would catch Andrew soon. He was a convicted felon on the run, and the state had launched a large-scale manhunt. But the irrational, emotional side of Tom was consumed by an almost primal fear. He knew the depth of Andrew's cruelty, and he knew Andrew had a singular obsession, controlling his daughter. Would Andrew try to take her again, to finish some twisted plan? The Petersons called Tom early the next morning to say that they were safe for now, that the police had been in regular contact, and that there were officers parked on the street at all hours. Eleanor was shaken, understandably so, but she had agreed to continue her daily routine as much as possible. Hiding in the house might only feed her sense of powerlessness. She would attend school under police protection, with officers stationed near the school grounds. Tom felt a rush of relief to know that the authorities were taking the threat seriously. Still, every second that Andrew remained at large was agonizing. The days dragged on, and each day without Andrew's capture frayed everyone's nerves. The local media plastered his face on their broadcasts, urging residents to report any sightings. Neighborhood watch groups set up phone trees. People locked their doors religiously, something many in the once placid town had never bothered with. Rumors spread that Andrew had been spotted in a nearby county, or that he had stolen a car. Without official confirmation, Tom could only guess which of the rumors were true. The uncertainty was maddening. Despite the around-the-clock security, Andrew found Eleanor. The question of how he managed to slip past the watchful eyes of the police or approach the Petersons' home without being detected would puzzle everyone later. But in the thick of it, one moment the night was quiet, the next it was shattered by the disappearance of Eleanor from her bedroom. Mrs. Peterson discovered her empty bed after a strange thump woke her in the middle of the night. She rushed to the bedroom, heart pounding, only to find the window wide open, curtains billowing in the breeze. The officers stationed outside saw and heard nothing. By the time the alarm was raised, Andrew and Eleanor had vanished into the night. Tom learned of the abduction in the earliest hours of the morning, when the Petersons phoned him, sobbing. He felt his world tilt. Despite all the precautions, Andrew had stolen his daughter away again. Tom's anger and fear merged into a single, fierce determination. This could not be allowed to stand. If there was any way on earth to save Eleanor, he would find it. He rushed to the Petersons' house, where the police were already swarming, searching the yard for footprints or any sign of forced entry. It seemed that Andrew had used cunning and stealth, cutting power to the outside security lights. No one had seen him approach or leave. Over the next 2 days, Tom barely slept or ate. He went to the police station repeatedly, demanding updates. The officers told him they were scouring every possible lead, contacting law enforcement in neighboring jurisdictions, and employing all resources to find Andrew. Helicopters with searchlights combed the forests and fields at the edges of the county. Officers with tracking dogs tried to follow any scent that might lead them to the fugitive. Tom volunteered to join a search party that ventured into a nearby patch of dense woodland, but his efforts yielded nothing. Andrew and Eleanor seemed to have vanished. Meanwhile, the FBI stepped in, broadening the investigation. Tension soared in Fairview. People put together volunteer search groups, posted flyers, and prayed for Eleanor's safe return. Tom walked around in a daze, unable to shake the vision of that terrified child, now back in the clutches of the monster she feared most. He replayed every conversation he had ever had with her, wondering if she had mentioned any location that Andrew might have considered a hideout. But he recalled nothing definitive, just vague references to Andrew once taking her fishing at a remote lake, or spending time in a dilapidated cabin in the countryside. The police looked into these places but came up empty. For Eleanor, those 2 days were an indescribable nightmare. Andrew had dragged her to an isolated cabin, forcing her to travel through back roads in the dead of night. She was disoriented, terrified, her mind flooded with panic. She kept thinking of how she had dared to hope for a normal life, only for her father to rip it all away. He bound her wrists to a chair at night, ranting about how he was the only family she needed, how she had betrayed him. The fear was so intense she could barely breathe. She clung to a single, trembling hope, that someone would find her, that Tom or the Petersons or the police would track Andrew down before he grew so desperate that he harmed her as he had harmed her mother. Back in town, the moment of breakthrough came when a hiker spotted fresh footprints near a remote trailhead in the forest. Something about the footprints, one set smaller, presumably a child's, caught his attention. He alerted the local authorities, who quickly converged on the area. Search dogs picked up the scent, leading the FBI and local law enforcement deeper into the woods. Eventually, they discovered an old dirt road that ended near an abandoned cabin, half collapsed but evidently still habitable. Signs of recent use, footprints, a battered car partially hidden behind brush, indicated Andrew might be inside. Tom arrived just as the standoff began to unfold. He had followed the police convoy, despite their protests that this was a dangerous situation. He could not bear the thought of waiting idly at home. When he saw the battered structure, his heart seized with dread. He imagined Eleanor inside, trembling in the dark, and it took all his willpower not to rush forward. The FBI and local law enforcement set up a perimeter, quietly surrounding the cabin. They tried to negotiate, to call out Andrew's name and tell him to surrender. There was no response at first. Then, through a broken window, Andrew shouted that they would never take him alive. He threatened to hurt Eleanor if anyone tried to approach. A hush fell over the surrounding woods, broken only by the occasional crunch of leaves underfoot as law enforcement repositioned themselves. The tension was as thick as the humid summer air. Tom stood behind a cluster of officers, eyes fixed on the cabin's door, which was boarded up from the inside. He could hardly breathe. The minutes stretched into an hour, then more. Negotiators used a megaphone to plead with Andrew, promising that no harm would come to him if he released Eleanor. His replies were incoherent, filled with rage and paranoia. As night approached, law enforcement decided they could no longer wait. Andrew was growing more agitated, and they feared for Eleanor's life. Shielding themselves behind bullet-resistant shields and protective gear that did not involve firearms, they forced the door open. Andrew let out a guttural scream, brandishing a metal crowbar. In the dim glow of a lantern, Eleanor could be seen huddled in a corner, her wrists chafed raw from the rope that had bound her. She was shaking uncontrollably, tears streaming down her face. Officers poured into the cabin, attempting to subdue Andrew. He swung the crowbar wildly, and for a moment, confusion reigned. The lantern toppled, sending shadows dancing across the rough wooden walls. One officer tried to grab Andrew's arm, only to be shoved against a broken table. Another lunged forward, managing to knock the crowbar from Andrew's hand. With a furious roar, Andrew pivoted and tackled one of the officers, trying to wrestle him to the ground. The fight was brutal. Fists connected with flesh, and furniture splintered under the force of struggling bodies. From outside, Tom could only hear the shouts and commotion. Every ounce of his being wanted to rush in, but law enforcement had formed a line to keep civilians out. Then, in a moment of chaos, Andrew broke free of one officer's grip and lunged toward the corner where Eleanor was cowering. She let out a shriek, trying to scramble away. Before he could lay a hand on her, another officer tackled him hard to the floor. Enraged, Andrew fought like a man possessed, his eyes wild with desperation. He tried to twist free, to use anything as a weapon. He reached a length of broken chair leg, brandishing it. But the officers were too many and too determined. They pinned him down, twisting his limbs until he roared in pain. In the process, his leg was wrenched at a terrible angle, causing a sickening crack. Andrew cried out, and his strength seemed to drain away. "Get him out of here!" the lead officer bellowed, and 2 more officers moved in, restraining Andrew. The rest rushed to Eleanor's side. She was pale as a ghost, her tear-stained cheeks shining in the lantern's glow. With shaking hands, she clung to the officer who untied her, too terrified to speak. Outside, Tom could see the flurry of movement as Andrew was dragged out of the cabin, cursing and wailing in pain. One of his legs hung at an unnatural angle, the pant leg stained with grime and likely blood. Finally, the paramedics, who had been waiting nearby, hurried in to treat him. Tom called out, "Eleanor! Eleanor!" But he was still held back, uncertain if it was safe for him to enter the scene. Moments later, an officer emerged carrying Eleanor. She was limp in his arms, her eyes squeezed shut. When Tom saw her, he rushed forward, ignoring the warnings to stay put. The officer gently transferred her into Tom's embrace. She clutched at him, shaking and sobbing, her fingers digging into his shirt as though he were the only solid thing in a world that had turned upside down. He pressed his cheek against her hair, tears filling his own eyes. "I'm here," he whispered in a trembling voice. "You're safe now." She only managed a weak "Tom," before her sobs overtook her. Carefully, he escorted her away from the chaos, letting the paramedics check her over. She had bruises, and she was severely dehydrated and exhausted, but she was alive. That simple fact overwhelmed Tom with relief so strong it nearly buckled his knees. Officers continued to swarm the cabin, collecting evidence and taking statements. Andrew lay on a stretcher, his broken leg immobilized, grimacing in pain. His cursing subsided to a low moan as they strapped him in. Soon, an ambulance whisked him away, back into the arms of law enforcement, and an even longer prison sentence that awaited him. In the aftermath, the authorities debriefed Tom, the Petersons, and everyone else involved. They explained that Andrew had used cunning and a willingness to vanish into remote areas to evade capture. He had likely scouted the Petersons' house days before, discovering a blind spot in the police patrol. The police captain apologized for failing to prevent the abduction, but also praised the search teams and the FBI for their relentless pursuit. Mostly, everyone was just relieved that Eleanor was alive and, despite her ordeal, not gravely injured. Once the immediate crisis ended, Eleanor was taken to the hospital for a thorough evaluation. Tom waited in the lobby alongside Mr. and Mrs. Peterson, who held each other's hands tightly. They all prayed that the emotional wounds would not be too severe, that the nightmares could be quelled with time and therapy. After a round of tests, the doctor confirmed she was physically stable, though traumatized. The staff recommended a stay for observation, just to ensure she was mentally and emotionally supported in the critical days ahead. That first evening in the hospital, Tom was allowed to see her. She was propped up on a pillow, an IV in her arm. Her eyes were red from crying, but she looked at Tom with a mixture of relief and weariness. "Thank you for coming," she whispered. "I wouldn't be anywhere else," Tom replied, lowering himself into the chair beside her bed. He hesitated, wanting to offer words of comfort, but nothing seemed sufficient for what she had endured. Finally, he took her hand gently, careful not to disturb the bruises. "You're safe now. He can't hurt you anymore." She blinked slowly. Her voice was soft as she said, I thought I'd never get out of there. That he would, that I'd end up like my mom." Tom's eyes filled with tears. He squeezed her hand. "Don't think about that now. You're here, and you're alive. And you have so many people who love you, who fought to find you. We will never let anything like that happen to you again." She exhaled, a trembling sigh that seemed to release a fraction of her pent-up terror. "Promise?" she asked in a small voice. "With all my heart," Tom replied. In that moment, time seemed to stand still, as though they were the only two people in the world. The bustle of hospital staff and the hum of medical machines faded into the background. What mattered was that Eleanor was safe, that Andrew's grip on her life had finally been broken. Tom felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude and relief, emotions so strong that he could do nothing but bow his head and allow a wave of quiet tears to fall. In the days that followed, the Petersons and Tom made sure someone was always at the hospital to keep Eleanor company. Friends from school sent cards and small gifts. Even Mrs. Reynolds stopped by, bringing a plush blanket embroidered with flowers. The local police chief visited, apologizing for the oversight that had allowed Andrew to snatch her but assuring her that justice would be served. Andrew, for his part, was placed under heavy guard in a prison infirmary, where his broken leg was treated. Further charges of kidnapping and assault awaited him, all of which would extend his prison sentence by decades. Eleanor would never have to face him again. A month later, life in Fairview returned to something approaching normalcy. The Petersons brought Eleanor back to their home, determined to help her recover from the fresh wave of trauma inflicted by Andrew's abduction. She began attending therapy sessions more frequently, focusing on coping mechanisms for her nightmares and flashbacks. Sometimes, late at night, she would wake up screaming, certain she heard Andrew's footsteps outside her window. Each time, Mrs. Peterson would rush to her room, holding her and reassuring her that Andrew was gone. Gradually, the nightmares lost their intensity, though they never vanished entirely. Tom continued to visit often, supporting her through this healing journey. They took walks through the neighborhood, occasionally stopping by the schools so that Eleanor could talk to Mrs. Reynolds. They revisited the park where they first met, pausing at the bench under the willow tree. Eleanor stood there for a long time, looking at the spot where she had pleaded for help so many months ago. The memory was painful, yet also a reminder of how far she had come. "I was so scared," she whispered, touching the bench. "But you listened to me." Tom nodded solemnly. "You were brave enough to speak up." They walked in silence after that, each absorbed in their memories. In some strange way, that bench had been the catalyst for everything that followed, the terror, the heartbreak, but also the rescue and the bonds that formed. Life had taken a cruel turn, but the worst was behind them now. As the leaves turned golden and began to fall, Eleanor's adoption by the Petersons was formalized. In a small ceremony at the courthouse, she signed papers that severed her legal ties to Andrew Smith once and for all, establishing the Petersons as her permanent family. Tom stood with them, beaming as the judge congratulated everyone on this joyous event. Tears of happiness and relief shone on Mrs. Peterson's face. Mr. Peterson held Eleanor's hand with paternal pride. For Eleanor, it was a moment of rebirth, a chance to leave behind the nightmares of her past and embrace a future shaped by love and support. Though the final quarter of Eleanor's story held no shortage of emotional turmoil, it was undeniably brighter. Andrew was back behind bars, never to trouble her again. She now had a legal family who cherished her and a caring friend in Tom. She pursued her passion for art more vigorously, channeling her experiences into paintings that spoke of resilience and survival. Some of her pieces depicted dark forests and lonely cabins, but always with a glimmer of light or a symbol of hope shining through. Her art teacher remarked on her progress, saying that in all her years she had rarely seen a student with such a fusion of talent and emotional depth. Tom, too, found his life changed in the aftermath. He was no longer the solitary mailman who silently delivered letters and returned home to an empty house. He still did his rounds, greeting neighbors with a deeper warmth than before, and he ended each day with a sense of purpose. He had witnessed the worst cruelty imaginable, but he had also seen the power of compassion, of standing up for someone who could not stand up for themselves. He realized that the quiet, unremarkable days he once took for granted were, in fact, precious. More importantly, he understood that genuine connections could be forged when people dared to care. On a bright afternoon, 1 month after Eleanor's rescue, the Petersons hosted a small gathering in their backyard to celebrate her formal adoption and her steps forward in healing. There were balloons, a homemade cake, and a handful of friends from school. Eleanor wore a modest dress and a shy smile, still a bit cautious in crowds, but radiating a quiet gratitude. Tom arrived with a gift wrapped in simple brown paper. Inside was a sketchbook with thick, high-quality pages and a set of watercolor pencils. He handed it to Eleanor with a small, uncertain smile. "I hope you like them," he said. "I've seen how amazing your art is, and I thought maybe this could help you paint even bigger and brighter things." She carefully unwrapped the present and ran her fingers over the cover of the sketchbook. "I love it," she said softly. Then, looking up at him, she whispered, "Thank you for everything, Tom." He cleared his throat, trying to control the rush of emotion. "I'm just glad to see you happy," he said. "You deserve it, more than anyone I know." She opened the sketchbook, flipping through the blank pages, each one a clean slate for new beginnings. "I might draw the Petersons' house," she mused. "And maybe you, delivering mail outside. I could draw Mrs. Reynolds, and my new friends too." Tom smiled, picturing the bright world she would create on those pages. The celebration lasted well into the evening, with neighbors dropping by to congratulate Eleanor and share in her joy. Laughter and the scent of barbecue filled the air. Fairy lights twinkled across the yard as dusk settled, casting the entire scene in a warm glow. Late into the night, after most guests had left, Tom found himself sitting by the fence, gazing at the stars. Eleanor joined him, the faintest breeze ruffling her hair. She breathed in the crisp air, and for a moment neither of them spoke. The hardships of the past were not forgotten, but they felt more distant, as though the shadows had receded. For the first time, she seemed free of the constant fear that Andrew would appear again. "I still miss my mom," she said quietly. "But I think she'd be happy for me, seeing how things turned out." Tom nodded. "I'm sure she'd be incredibly proud of you." They sat in companionable silence, letting the hush of the night envelop them. Around them, the Petersons' yard rustled with nocturnal life, crickets chirping, a gentle wind brushing through the bushes. Finally Eleanor spoke, her voice determined yet peaceful. "I'm going to be all right." Tom placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "I know you will," he said. "You're one of the bravest people I've ever met." In that quiet, star-studded moment, it was as though the long and turbulent journey had finally reached a harbor. There would still be storms ahead, memories that would resurface, pains that might never fully vanish, but the future was open and hopeful. Eleanor had found a family, and she had found her strength. Tom had discovered compassion within himself that he never knew could run so deep. And as they both looked toward the sky, it was clear that the darkest chapters had ended, replaced by the promise of new beginnings. The final stretch of that year brought continued healing. Eleanor attended therapy regularly, forging healthy coping mechanisms for her lingering trauma. Her artwork thrived, and she entered a few local art competitions, receiving heartfelt praise for the emotion captured in her pieces. She continued to lean on Tom as a confidant, and he, in turn, delighted in watching her grow into a confident, kind young girl. At home, the Petersons celebrated every small victory, from Eleanor's first day back at school without a panic attack, to her willingness to spend time with friends at a local ice cream parlor. On weekends, they sometimes invited Tom to join them for dinner or a family outing, bridging the gap between the quiet mailman's solitary world and the newfound joy of shared experiences. Each passing day chipped away at the vestiges of fear. Eventually, Andrew was transferred from the prison infirmary back into maximum security. His injuries healed, but his future outside prison walls had effectively ended. The community of Fairview moved on, though the memory of what had happened lingered in hushed whispers. People came to understand that it was often the quiet, watchful souls, like Tom, who could make the biggest difference when tragedy struck. Eleanor's new reality was one filled with the ordinary joys and sorrows of a budding teenage life. She had homework to finish, friends to text, and a supportive home environment that provided safety. Whenever she felt echoes of dread, she reminded herself that Andrew could no longer harm her. She held fast to the love she had found, and the knowledge that she had emerged, scarred but unbroken, from the darkest of nightmares. Tom's role in her life remained that of a gentle guardian, though he stepped back enough to let her flourish independently as she grew older. He still stopped by on occasion, carrying the day's mail. He and Eleanor would exchange a smile, a promise that their bond was unshakable. Sometimes, she would show him her latest artwork, or ask for advice on how to approach a new project. Other times, they would reminisce quietly, acknowledging the pain of the past while focusing on the bright horizons ahead. In that sense, Fairview's story became one of renewal. The little town that had once seemed too still, too complacent, had been shaken awake by tragedy. Yet it had also proven that beneath the serene surface were people capable of compassion, courage, and the determination to stand against evil. From Mrs. Reynolds, who made the first call to Child Protective Services, to the Petersons, who opened their home to a broken child, to the law enforcement officers and FBI agents who scoured forests to rescue her, everyone played a part in ensuring that justice and hope prevailed. Months rolled into a year, and the day finally came when Eleanor looked in the mirror and realized that her nightmares had faded to distant echoes. She still felt pangs of grief for her mother, and she still carried wounds that might take a lifetime to heal, but she was forging a future under her own power. On the anniversary of her rescue, she created a painting that depicted her mother's face, surrounded by gentle beams of sunlight. She titled it simply, Hope. When she showed it to Tom, he felt tears sting his eyes. In that painting, he saw not just sorrow, but promise, a testament to the life that lay before her. In the end, the story of Tom Warren and Eleanor Smith was one of quiet, steadfast courage and the transformative power of compassion. It was a story of a small town forced to confront a hidden darkness, and of the individuals who rose to the challenge, refusing to let evil triumph. Though the journey had been fraught with terror and heartbreak, it culminated in the unshakable truth that even in the face of unimaginable cruelty, love and empathy could shine a light that no darkness could extinguish. Eleanor's final words to Tom that anniversary evening captured the essence of their shared journey. "I'm glad you were there that day," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "You changed everything for me." Tom responded, voice thick with emotion. "You changed everything for me too," he admitted. "And I'll always be here for you." They both smiled, a small but significant promise that the bond forged in crisis had grown into something life-affirming and enduring. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the peaceful streets of Fairview, it was clear that the future beckoned with the warmth of a healing heart and the resilient spirit of those who fought for justice, no matter the cost. Thanks for watching till the end. If you enjoyed the story, give this video a like if you haven't already and subscribe for more.